The Prince Warriors and the Swords of Rima, Chapter 2. Finn. Finn ran to the edge of the rocky precipice and skidded to a halt, sending a flurry of pebbles into the deep fog below. His heart beat like crazy in his chest. He couldn't look down without feeling dizzy. He panted hard, struggling for breath. The narrow rock he stood on shook as the pounding footfalls of the forgers closed in. Finn had no idea where he was now, but he knew he had nowhere to go. Finn had been out exploring the land of Ahoritas, learning the ins and outs of being a prince warrior. After a life spent in the dark prison of Skatos, the beauty and splendor offered on this side of Ahoritas nearly overwhelmed his senses. Forests with trees as tall as mountains, rivers and streams with water that sparkled like fine jewels, rolling hills choked with wild flowers of every imaginable color. Color itself was something wholly new to Finn, who had lived in a world of endless gray for as long as he could remember. He was about to head back to the cave when he heard a sound, like a cry for help, so pitiful and sad it nearly broke his heart. He had heard that sound before, coming from his own mouth, as he had sat in Ponyros's prison, losing all hope that he would ever get out. He ran toward the pathetic wail, which led him to a bridge that spanned a deep chasm. He stopped, gazing at the pretty cobblestone walkway with the ivy-covered railings. Was this the bridge of tears that separates Skatos from the rest of Ahoritas? The one he had heard about when he was still a prisoner? He wasn't sure. But then the cry came again. Finn drew nearer as he did. As he did, he noticed that halfway across the bridge, the rustic cobblestones morphed into black steel girders, which disappeared into a thick fog on the other side. He felt a chill run down his spine. Skatos must lie beyond that fog, he thought. But he assumed that as long as he stayed on this side of the bridge, he would be okay. Again, the horrible cry of distress filled the air, and a figure emerged from the fog, limping toward Finn over the metal girders. He gasped. It looked like a prisoner of Skatos. The figure was dragging one of his metal-encased legs behind him, obviously struggling, desperate to escape from that dark, malevolent place. Finn felt a rush of adrenaline. He had to help rescue this prisoner as he himself had been rescued. He had been hoping for an opportunity like this ever since he had received his armor from Ruach and begun learning the ways of prince warriors. Without thinking further, Finn ran over the bridge toward the prisoner, who looked at him pleadingly, whimpering, unable to speak any words. "I'll help you," Finn whispered. "Quickly, come with me." Finn reached out to take hold of the prisoner's arm, but as soon as he did, he knew that he had made a mistake. The prisoner's half-human face darkened and hardened. His body lengthened, straightened, new plates of metal taking over the uneven patches of human flesh. The prisoner's human-looking eyes disappeared behind round, red, glowing discs. This was not a prisoner at all. It was a forger, one of the freakish, metallized agents of the enemy. Finn snatched his hand away and turned to run. The forger grabbed for his shoulder, but Finn managed to evade him. He glanced back and saw that there were several more of them charging out of the mist on the Skatos side of the bridge. They had lain in wait for him. It was a trap. Finn was naturally pretty fast, and his boots made him feel as though he were flying over the cobblestones. But the forger's huge steps covered twice as much ground at the same time. Once off the bridge, Finn tried to run back to the cave, but he wasn't sure of the way, and he was too busy fleeing forgers to pay attention to the blinking light of his breastplate. Now he regretted it. Somehow he had made a wrong turn and ended up trapped on this narrow ledge that jutted out over a seemingly bottomless pit. He skidded to a halt and heard the sound of pebbles cascading into the deep fog below. There was no escape. His heart pounded. He struggled to breathe. "Ruach, someone help me!" Finn cried aloud. He got no reply. The forgers closed in on him, their metal hands reaching out to grab him. Finn knew that he was done for. He would turn back into the half-metal prisoner he had been before. No, he could not let that happen. He was not going back there again. Then he remembered his shield. He pulled the tiny red seed out of his pocket and thrust his arm out before him. The shield burst forth from his tightly closed fist, a spray of brilliant red lights creating a dome of protection around him. The forgers stopped in their tracks and roared, waving their metal arms around angrily. Finn let out a breath of relief. He kept his arm straight out and tried to take a step forward, pushing back against the strength of the forgers with his shield, but they appeared to be immovable. He tried again with no luck. He kept his arm erect, but began to feel the pressure of the forgers mounting as they closed in on him, pushing, pressing. He struggled to keep his shield deployed. As he stood there, protected but still surrounded, he felt the ground under his feet shift. He glanced down and saw a crack forming in the rock of the precipice. In a moment, it would break off and he would fall into the pit. "Tell me what to do," he called out, hoping Ruach, wherever he was, could hear. The orb of his breastplate began to spin, churning out words that hovered in the air before him. "Resist the enemy, and he will flee." Finn remembered this instruction from the book the last time he had been with Ruach in the cave. That word rolled around in his mind. Resist. The only other time he had heard about resistance was from his high school football coach during weight training. The heavier the resistance, the more muscle you will build, the stronger you will become. He had bellowed over the clank-clank sound of the heavy metal plates. Resist the enemy and he will flee. Build strength, heavier, more muscle. Finn braced himself, gathering all his strength and focusing it on the arm that held the shield. This was all he could think of to do. He opened his mouth and let out a thunderous growl as he pushed his shield into the forgers with all his might. Then he took one step toward them. Resist. Resist. He took another step, gasping for breath, every muscle in his body straining to the breaking point. He could feel the rock he stood on give way. He could hear the ominous cracking, the showering of pebbles as it began to break. He kept his focus on his shield, moving, pushing, resisting. His renewed resolve seemed to weaken the forgers, for now they were inching backward, their heavy iron feet kicking up dust and dirt that lodged in their metal joints, causing them to stumble. Resist. The faltering of the forgers gave Finn new energy, and he pushed harder and harder, leaping over the crack just as the rocky precipice broke free. He teetered on the edge of the chasm, throwing all his weight into the force of the shield. He thought his arm might break from the effort, but he kept it out straight, his fist clamped on the seed. He took another step, and another. Resist. Soon he was clear of the edge and gaining traction, pushing the now powerless and clumsy forgers backward. A new plan formed in his mind. He sidestepped in a circle so that the forgers were forced to swivel with him. Now they were the ones with their backs to the chasm. Finn let out a yell, a brawling victory cry, as he thrust the forgers steadily backward, his resistance as lethal to them as kryptonite to Superman. The forgers howled as if in pain, waving their arms helplessly. Finn was practically running now as he steered the forgers right to the edge. With one last powerful thrust, he sent them reeling over the edge. He watched as all of them cascaded into the mist below, disappearing from view. He stood motionless for several seconds, shocked and paralyzed at the sound of their pitiful cries. As the noise subsided, Finn retracted his shield and stared out into the empty distance. He closed his eyes and let out a long, long breath. It was over. He had done it. He had faced the forgers and beaten them. But instead of pride, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Without the guidance of Ruach, the instruction from the source, and the power of the armor, he would never have prevailed. Well done, Prince Finn. Finn whirled to see Ruach standing behind him, his hands folded into the long sleeves of his purple robe, his face still invisible in the deep hood. Finn knelt at once, bowing his head. He always did this when Ruach appeared to him. Ruach had taken away his metal parts and made him whole again, fully human again. His only desire now was to serve Ruach and the source with all his being. Suddenly, Finn noticed that Ruach was not alone. The other prince warriors had met in the cave, walked up beside him, looking at Finn quizzically. They seemed surprised to find themselves here with him. What happened? Asked the tallest one. Xavier, where'd those forgers go? Finn pointed silently to the edge of the cliff. What? They just went over? Said the youngest, Evan. He looked shocked. Did you throw them off? Asked Levi, the kid with the low-cut afro. Finn shrugged. I just resisted. You did indeed, said Ruach. They didn't anticipate that you would. Who, the forgers? Ruach nodded. They did not expect one so young or newly freed to know the secret power of resistance. Finn lifted his head a little in a humble sort of pride. You were tested, Ruach continued, and now you have been strengthened by your resolve. You are ready now. He paused as if in thoughtful reflection. In fact, you all are. He extended one of his long arms out to encompass the kids. Ready? For what? Said the dark-haired girl, Brianna, tilting her head. Ruach's arm stretched up. His white, glowing hand emerged from his sleeve, one long finger pointing towards something in the distance. Finn and the children all turned to look in that direction. Ruach was pointing to the tall mountain that stood at the very center of Ahoritas. Its peak was invisible underneath a veil of clouds, but only for a moment. When Ruach pointed, the clouds began to separate, pulling back like a curtain to reveal the top of the mountain fully for the first time. It was entirely flat, as if the tip had been cut off. Cool, whispered the red-haired girl, Ivy. A volcano. Possibly a fumarole, said Manuel, who seemed to know about such things, although I've never seen anything quite like that. A thick white vapor steamed from the flat peak of the mountain. It did look an awful lot like a volcano, except different. For although the mountain appeared very still and calm, they could sense a movement within it, like the pulse of blood pumping through a vein. Somehow, the entire mountain seemed to rise and fall steadily, and they were certain that they could hear a soft, wispy sound ascend from its flattened peak, each hushed exhale in cadence with the steady rhythm. It was as if the mountain were breathing. The mountain of Rima, Ruach said. He spoke the words very quietly, as if even he were awed by them. The mountain awakens when it is time. Time for what? Xavier stepped forward, his eyes glued to Ruach. Time for you to receive your swords. Oh, goodness. I'm sure Evan is excited because he's been wanting a sword all along. Okay, that's the end for tonight.